Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Utah Lake Roundtable. My name is James Swensen, and I'm pleased and privileged to be able to chair this session. I'd like to thank you all for being here. And the way we're going to do this is each of the presenters today, we were originally to have 4, but we will only have 3. Each of us are going to give presentations dealing with our work and our reactions and our relationship to Utah Lake. We'll each be presenting first, but that should also open enough time for a roundtable and questions. So we encourage you, obviously, to take note, and that so we can have a nice discussion at the end of this. I'm going to present each of our presenters today in reverse order. And the first, and this is somewhat, I've never had to introduce myself, and I don't know if I really like this. But James R. Swensen is an associate professor of art history and the history of photography at Brigham Young University. And he's overinflated everything so far. His scholarship focuses on American photography and the visual representation of the American West, and particularly Utah places. He's the author of the book In a Rugged Land, Ansel Adams, Dorothy Lang, and the Three Mormon Towns Collaboration, 1953 to 1954. It's amazing how I get kind of ruffled when someone screws this up, and yet I'm screwing it up on my own introduction today. And I also was able to co-author with Mike Taylor and Farina King, Returning Home, DNA Creative Works from the Intermountain Indian School, which was published in 2021. Our second presenter is Jared Tamez, sorry, I knew I was going to pronounce that wrong, who earned a bachelor's degree in history from Brigham Young University, a master's in history from the University of Utah, and studied U.S.-Mexico borderland history in a PhD program at the University of Texas, El Paso. He currently works for a national finance services company and is also an award-winning professional photographer. I'm looking forward to that. Our final presenter is Ben Abbott. He is a professor of environmental science and sustainability at Brigham Young University. He studies aquatic ecosystems, renewable energy, climate feedbacks, wildfire, and environmental pollution. He is particularly interested in science, communication, and improving our commitment to environmental stewardship. He and his wife, Rachel, have 4 children who take after them in their love of animals, TV, and biking. So those will be our presenters for today. As I mentioned, we're going to do this in reverse order. So I am going to begin. And I would also, as part of this, like to thank Jed Rogers, who was the one who kind of really put this thing together. But I also need to thank Holly George and the other participants of this panel. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm really interested in the visual representation of Utah places through photography, painting, and other means. And I was born and raised in Salt Lake City. I continue to live in Salt Lake City. And this is a place throughout this entire state, actually, are places that continue to interest me, not only in terms of my scholarship, but also just the experience of place. And like many of you, I've had a lot of contact with Utah Lake over the years. My family, actually, my father's family is from Provo. And so we have, throughout the years, I've been able to see Utah Lake and to ignore Utah Lake, like many of you. And as I was riding the train home last night from work, I came across this vista, which you can see here, which I experience every time I take the train, which is every day I come to work. And yet I rarely ever see it. And so this observation is a part of what I want to do today and provide some other observations of Utah Lake, but especially in connection to its representation over the years. And I really believe that Utah Lake provides an opportunity to explore a place that was celebrated, but has been forgotten. And in fact, it's puzzling to me how a place that was seen as so beautiful, so important, has fallen into near complete obsolescence. It is the second largest lake in the state, as you probably know, the largest freshwater body, and it is located in the heart of the state's largest metropolitan area. And yet, remarkably, we don't take time to talk about the lake, we don't take time to look at the lake, and we really don't take much time to actually represent it, as I'll talk about today. And actually, we'll see maybe a counter to this in Jared's presentation. But I want you to also know that this is not always been the case. It should be noted that Utah Lake sits on the ancestral lands of the Timpanogos, Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples. In 1776, it was the Timpanogos people who encountered the Dominguez Escalante expedition in their search of an overland route from Santa Fe to the bountiful Spanish holdings in California. They arrived in Provo Valley, or what was then called the Nuestra Sephora de la Merced de los Timpanogos, on September 23rd, 1776. They noted when they arrived that the lake was beautifully situated and replete with what they called excellent natural features. Here's the map. Surrounded by mountains that were, quote, teeming with several kinds of edible fish, in addition to geese, beaver, and other land and water animals, which we did not see, unquote. They suggested that many large towns could actually benefit from the abundance of the area. And as Jared Farmer has pointed out, their cartographer was even more bullish on the region, stating that the area around the lake was, quote, the most pleasant, beautiful, and fertile in all of New Spain, and that it could support a city with a population as large as Mexico City. I think many of you are like, man, it's a good thing we don't have a population the size of Mexico City in this valley. The first representations of Utah Lake were found on the map that was later produced by the Dominguez Escalante expedition. And what I really enjoy about this is it's right on the top, right? It's presented in this lofty position, a lofty goal for future colonization. It stops, in fact, at the border. The map stops at the border of Utah Lake, which is not a surprise because on this, the Great Salt Lake is not represented. In fact, when the party learned about the Great Salt Lake, they learned, quote, its waters are harmful and extremely salty. Wherefore, the Timpanogos Indians assure us that anybody getting a part of his body wet instantly feels a severe itch around the wet part, unquote. And many of you who've experienced the Great Salt Lake know that that's true. And remember, it's that juxtaposition between the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake that's one of the important things I want to discuss today. One was seen as having life, the other harmful and extremely salty and major body itch, if not worse. The Spanish did not come and make a New Mexico City in Utah Valley, but the Mormons did. And they saw this as a promised land, a refuge, and in fact, a new Holy Land, which is reiterated by the famous map that sets in juxtaposition the Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake as the new Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, right? Again, the juxtaposition being profoundly made here. This new Sea of Galilee, this new region, obviously was very attractive to Mormon settlers who began coming here in the spring of 1849. In fact, as they came down, the Timpanogos made them promise they would not be removed from the land. Obviously, that didn't happen, thanks in part to the Battle Creek War of 1849 and the Provo Indian Wars in February of 1850. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, actually I can do it this one. Colonization settlement continued in this region for the next few decades, as you know, and by the time you get to later representation, by the time you get to the turn of the century, you start to have artists who are going to depict this. The first I'd like to look at is J.T. Harwood. Harwood is a central figure in Utah art. He was born in Lehi, so he's born actually with good view sheds of the lake and grew up with the lake in his backyard. Harwood was not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but his parents were. And he's the first, in fact, he goes to Salt Lake City and studies with Dan Wegland, who we just looked at, but he was the first to go to Paris to study, first from the Utah Territory to go to Paris, the art capital of the world, where he studied at the Académie Julian, as well as the École des Beaux-Arts. In fact, this work, he receives awards for his work from the Paris Salon, which was a very lofty recognition for a kid from the sticks. Upon his return, he actually comes home not with an academic style, but Impressionism was the hot style at the time in Paris. And so when he comes home, right, he picks up this Impressionist palette with brushstrokes, capture an impression. And one of the places he loved to go, right, he loved recreation. He loved to recreate in Salt Lake, but he also loved to recreate in Utah County. And you can see his representation here of Utah Lake, one that presents this scene as one of majesty and sublime beauty in the Wasatch Mountains in the background, but also a place of idyllic pursuits and beauty. The other individual who is working in this area is John Hafen. Although born in Switzerland, Hafen spent much of his life in Springville, and Hafen in particular was one who was attracted to the picturesque landscapes of Utah. He, like Harwood, returned from Paris after studying to be as one of the art missionaries who learned to paint in order to paint the walls of the Salt Lake Temple, returns with a very impressionistic palette, which he used to represent Utah Lake. And if you're looking at this thing like, man, this is the idyllic version of what Utah Lake was. This beautiful big freshwater lake surrounded by mountains that presented not only a place of beauty, but also of recreation. And Hafen, who is, I would argue, our best painter of this region, used his skills to represent these places well. And yet, in these images, something I want you to see is what they also represent. According to Nathan Reese, and I'm going to quote Nathan here, quote, "To Latter-day Saint settlers, the Intermountain West was more than just a geographical location. It was a divinely appointed refuge where the saints could build the community of Zion. Thus, every image of Utah's landscape was already a representation of the divine mandate that Mormons claimed to justify their colonial project. Latter-day Saint artists did not simply record the topography of Utah, but they painted orderly farms and settlements that reified Mormonism's divinely patterned order." And I think in Hafen and Harwood, you can see that. But there's going to be a gap. And it's not until later in the 20th century that you see artists actually ignoring. Well, you continue. They don't go to Utah Lake, but they start to ignore it. You see that in the work of B.F. Larson, who was the head of art at BYU. But you also see it in a wonderful mural that I've been working on a lot this year. And what's wonderful about this is I want you to actually cross the street and go kitty corner from this, and you can see good old Ev Thorpe's mural that was done for the PWAP. It's often associated, right, as a WPA project. And this was for the original post office, not the original post office, but the post office here in Provo. Ebb Thorpe's title of this work is Old and Modern Provo, which he painted in 1942. And Thorpe, who was a painter from Logan, actually from Providence, but taught at Utah State, what is now Utah State University, did a lot of homework. He came down to Utah County. He talked to historians. He talked to old timers. And what's fascinating about this in this very Thomas Benton-esque landscape in which it kind of swirls and undulates through the canvas is that he shows us what is both good and bad about Utah County. In the bottom left-hand corner, he in fact emphasizes Dimmick Huntington, who was one of the first settlers in the spring of 1849, who made an oath to the Timpanogos that the Mormons would not take their land. And I think you can see here that Ev Thorpe is clearly, right, commenting on this and showing in Dimmick Huntington's closed lip oath that they weren't going to keep their promise. The sunflowers at his elbow, in fact, show just how earthbound his oath really was. Utah Lake is not represented in Ev Thorpe's great large mural, but it is represented indirectly. He shows, in fact, the original fishermen, right, the first to come down and to find out how plentiful and bountiful Utah Lake was, who were represented by these two fishermen here. He also, though, in the background, represented the future of Provo. Provo and this area was in a period of profound change. And here he suggested something that was going on right around him. In fact, just up the street, as you can see, recorded by the great photographer Andreas Feiniger, Geneva Still was being built in an effort, as you can see in the caption, to provide needed steel for the war effort. And Geneva is going to obviously change this landscape in profound ways. Here's the intake, right? The creation of the intake piping that is going to bring water in from Utah Lake to make this massive industry possible. But what's also fascinating about this is it does transform how we look at the lake. It, in fact, is not that idyllic place that we saw in Harwood and Hafen, but becomes more of an industrial landscape. And I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only person in this room who can remember this area crossing over the point of the mountain if you're coming from Salt Lake City and seeing the massive hulk of Geneva, of the steel mill. And the smell, I mean, I remember distinctly as a child, I knew exactly when I had entered Utah County because there was a distinctive change that took place. And I think what happens is because of this, Utah artists move away from this landscape. They don't depict it as often, right, as we obviously saw in the past. And I think in many ways that this sets up, right, the fact that Utah artists, instead of looking at places like Utah Lake, found solace and found inspiration and found their subject matter in places far afield. Many of you have been lured by Utah's great landscapes, by the national parks, and feel the siren song of Red Rock, and so did our Utah artists. And yet, we come back to the scene because obviously Utah Lake has potential in so many different ways. And however, as you also know, beginning especially in the 21st century, the way we look at the lake, the way we interact with the lake has changed. And that has particularly been made more acute by the algae blooms and other things that continue beginning around 2015 and continue through 2016 and beyond. And the effect and the look of the lake starts to change. And one of the images, here's just a few more, you can see how the lake, that pristine blue thing that once appeared in John Haven's paintings, has transformed profoundly. And I want to stop with this one for 1 second. Here we have Rick Egan. Egan is a photographer for the Salt Lake Tribune, who in 2016 made aerial photographs of the algae bloom that was making not just dogs and cattle sick, but 100 swimmers who were made sick from the bloom there. What I find fascinating about these scenes is how they relate strongly to what's happening in photography today. You have a number of photographers like Edward Burtynsky, whose work you see here, who are very interested in both aerial view and on the ground view of showing the technological sublime. Sometimes what's referred to jokingly as eco-porn, that we like looking at it and yet we understand the disastrous consequences that can happen from some of these. Here's just two Edward Burtynskys, and you can see, I think, in relation to Egan's photograph of Utah Lake I showed you, the parallels that can be made. But I'd also like to relate this to David Meisel. Meisel is an artist, a painter, a photographer, but who for the last few years has been making aerial views, aerial photographs of places like lakes around the West, but from 2003 to 2005, does a whole series called The Terminal Mirage, in which he makes aerial views of the Great Salt Lake. And these aerial views, he says, this aerial survey, quote, of this surreal, apocalyptic, and strangely beautiful region. These depictions of damaged wastelands, he writes, where human efforts have eradicated the natural order, are both spectacular and horrifying. So here you see 3 images from the Terminal Mirage series from David Meisel, which were made literally just a short distance to the north. Again, what I find fascinating is that at one point there was the juxtaposition between the way we saw Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake, but with images like this, and if we see more of images like this, that juxtaposition, that difference between one and the other are going to continue to decrease. Now, the proposed bridge that was to cross Utah Lake that was proposed in 2009, I think is emblematic of a new relationship that we have with the lake. As you can see here, it's not about the lake anymore. And what was once the most desirable landscape in Utah has now become a freeway. And I think this is also emblematic of our impulse to bypass and ignore the lake itself. In fact, other plans that have been coming up, like the lake restitution solution, which I'm not going to go into too much, right? In which a massive city would be built on the billions of cubic yards that would be dredged from the bottom to clean up the lake. And you'd have settlements that they propose up to 100,000 people could be living on Utah Lake if this goes through. And they also actually designed this, one of the island patterns that would actually be delicate arch, which I find very ironic and kind of funny. I think whether it's this or whether it's this, the proposed look at Vineyard, which I think in many ways kind of harkens back to the images we saw of Hafen and Harwood, are again, ignoring the problem. showing the lake, trying to figure out these almost magical solutions for a problem that we tend to bypass, ignore, and yet have really struggled to fix. And I'm sure my fellow panelists can speak more to this. And yet, in closing, I think there are observations that can be made. I know that searching Google image is not a scientific study, but if you do just Google Utah Lake and then punch up the images, you'll see some very interesting themes. You'll see a lot of images of Utah Lake in the winter. And in fact, the patterns that are made in the ice, as Jared will show, I mean, get some of the most beautiful ones I've actually excited to see. I've just saw it in just briefly before Swensen, but I think these also, right, capture a lake in a very different season in which it's not the big, beautiful blue lake anymore, but it's this quiet, sterile landscape. Probably my favorite application of lake. In fact, if you Google Utah Lake, you'll see a lot of images of people, right, of families, as you can see here, of weddings, right? It's become probably one of the most attractive backdrops, but it is just a prop in fact, not just a prop, but a minor prop. And you can see, like, I probably Googled this way too much, and I've spent way too much time looking at other people's wedding photographs. And if you know any of these people, I apologize ahead of time. But I find it fascinating that every single one of them, Utah Lake, the thing that is probably the most beautiful part of this landscape, or could be the most beautiful part of the landscape and these photographs, is briefly mentioned. It's just there as an aside. And again, as I said, as a minor prop. Sometimes you combine both of them. You combine winter and wedding, and can you go wrong with that? No, although I've yet to figure out exactly what this is. So if you know these people, I truly apologize, because these are the most puzzling wedding photographs I've ever seen. And maybe I don't want to see any more, right? And yet I think there's potential. And I think, as we'll see in Jared's presentation coming up, that there is potential, that obviously we need to go back and we can't ignore this anymore. This thing that sits in the middle of where most of us live, this thing that has potential, that we can return to again, that we can represent again, that we can figure out a way to move forward. And actually, as I mentioned my presentation today to my students, to my photography students yesterday, one of them spoke up and says, I've got a really good image of Utah Lake. And so it's with Lily Balliff, my brilliant student, that I end this presentation with this work. And if I've yet to figure out exactly what's going on with the wedding photographs I showed you, I've yet to figure out what's going on in Lily's work, but I love it, right? At least he's in the lake, taking advantage of the lake. And it's with this, folks, that I end my presentation. So thank you.
And for our moderator, photography at Utah Lake, and then I'll just close with a few remarks. Thank you so much for putting this panel together. I was in history for a while, and I've been away for a long time. I haven't presented at a conference, so this is a rare treat. Has potential are the words that ring in my ears. And I say, not only does it have potential, it's already there. What needs to have potential is us to perceive it, to perceive what is already there. And I'm struck by James's talking about how those who grew up here know about Geneva, came to see the lake in certain ways. And I come from Texas. I came up to BYU for the undergraduate, and I heard here and there about Geneva steel, but I didn't have that ingrained like presence of Geneva steel as this foreboding or this polluting entity. And I think that's probably, or potentially, when I eventually could open my eyes, that allowed me to come to the lake without those preconceptions, without those negative stereotypes, without those expectations. But I came to the lake with expectations of my own, expectations that I would find something beautiful if I just looked for it. And I remember those earliest days when I was just getting into photography, maybe only 3 years ago. I worked close to a lake access in the American Fork. And I just went wandering around on my lunch break one day and just like, whoa, there's this lake out there. I've been here for 10, 15 years and I've never gone to it. What is that? How do you get to it? I didn't know how to get to the lake. And it took me poking around, Googling around and looking around. And I finally, oh, there are access points for the public. Okay, let me go to one. And I went and it was like, okay, all right. Walking around, not getting my shoes wet or anything, not getting them muddy, just kind of like, oh, all right, good. There's potential here. That's where I was. There's potential. And as I spent more time there, as I got my shoes muddy, as I got into it, I found what it already was. It's a thing of rare beauty. You get perspectives 360 degrees in all seasons, north, south, east, west, wherever you're looking, you can see some vista that is sweeping and extraordinary. Lake mountains to the west, providing a backdrop for the sunsets that can explode and which can then mirror in still, somewhat calm and shallow waters. To the east, Y Mountain, Cascade Mountain. Just within the last week, go out at sunrise in any morning, now that it's winter, you're going to see a pink and blue ombre that is just remarkable. It's not too overcast. Any morning for the next few months, just take a moment to look at it. I saw wonderful things. And I think to James's point also, we've lost here a generation, maybe two, of folks who used to come to the lake, who used to have the lake as part of their family routine, part of their DNA to recreate here. And misinformation, well, some true information. I mean, the lake has had its issues with pollution, but it's been on the road to recovery for a long time. And that's the part that nobody understands. That's the part that nobody wants to hear. Or if they hear it, they don't believe it. And it's going to take reacquainting. It's going to take coming to it. And so to bridge to the slideshow, just want to say, in terms of that misinformation, just recently, Governor Cox was asked about Utah Lake. There's this pretty substantial controversy about building islands and developing the lake bed. And he made the remark that the Utah Lake is a trashed lake. And, advocates have all scratched their heads and rubbed their temples because this is just perpetuating the misinformation that's out there about what Utah Lake is and the journey that it's been on towards recovery. And so I'll invite you to watch this and we'll ask, is this a trashed lake to you?